Today we will be studying the Gettysburg Address, a speech delivered by President Abraham Lincoln, the most beloved and popular of the American presidents. The Gettysburg Address was delivered at the dedication of a cemetery on November 19, 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. The Gettysburg Address was delivered at a small rural town, a town called Gettysburg in the state of Pennsylvania, and it was delivered in November, many months after the battle had been fought over there. The Union and Confederate forces had engaged in a 3-day battle at the Gettysburg battlefield, wherein nearly 50,000 soldiers died. Today we will be studying the speech in terms of its backgrounds, both the immediate background of the dedication ceremony as well as the background of the Battle of Gettysburg, in terms of the Civil War itself, and also in terms of the speech and its use of space and time, as well as allusions and other stylistic features within the speech. It was meant to be a battlefield wherein the Confederate forces would have won a decisive victory over the Union, but it turned around the battle itself, and instead it turned into a Union victory. The battle raged from July 1st to July 3rd in 1863, and during the course of the battle, the Union forces lost 23,000 soldiers, whereas the Confederate soldiers lost 25,000 soldiers. Thus, nearly 50,000 men lost their lives during this battle. In November 1863, a new cemetery was dedicated to the nation and at Gettysburg, and invited to the dedication ceremony was the President Abraham Lincoln, though he was not the chief orator who was to speak the main oration. That role was given to Edward Everett, one of the most renowned and popular orators of the time. Indeed, calling President Lincoln was something of an afterthought, because he was asked at the last moment to deliver a few appropriate remarks. Everett, of course, spoke for 2 hours. He received sustained applause, and his speech was supposed to be remarkable. After that, President Lincoln was asked to speak. He spoke for 2 minutes. In fact, before the audience realized that Lincoln was speaking, he had finished and had sat down. And the speech itself was just about 270 words long. The dedicatory speeches were widely reported in the newspapers the next day. And though most of them acclaimed rapturously Edward Everett's 2-hour-long speech, most of them were dismissive of President Lincoln's speech. And they claimed that it shamed not just the Great War and the Union, but also the many dead at Gettysburg. However, Edward Everett, the famed, renowned orator of the time, congratulated President Lincoln and said that he himself could not in 2 hours have done what Lincoln had done in 2 minutes. The Civil War in America was waged between the Union forces and the Southern secessionist states between 1861 and 1865. The seeds for the war were sown with the advent of slavery in America, which happened sometime in the second decade of the 1600s. Given that America was first settled from 1607 onwards, and that the Mayflower arrives in America in the second decade, slavery began at the same time as the American nation itself began. It is interesting to note that even though slavery was begun so early and continued to be entrenched till the mid-19th century, yet the American nation, in its Declaration of Independence, spoke of the idea that all men were created equal. Thus, there is, right at the beginning of the American state itself, a disjuncture between what they said and what was actually practiced. The Civil War began with the secession of the southern states of America over several simmering issues that divided the northern and the southern states. Primary amongst them was the issue of slavery and the issue of federal authority. The southern states believed that they deserved and required more independence than the federal rules of America gave to them at the time. The southern states also, with their cotton plantations, their large acreage of land which had to be farmed and planted by black labor, depended upon slaves for cheap labor, which cost them practically nothing, and where they were not required to pay the actual rates that labor required. They thought that all of their freedom was called into question with the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1861. And so they decided to make the move that they had to make before Abraham Lincoln was to abolish slavery. Initially, 7 states seceded, and later 4 more joined them. The first 2 years of the war saw Confederate victories, so much so that their general, Robert E. Lee, actually believed and planned a decisive battle which he believed then would lead to the invasion of the northern states, and that would cause the war to end. The Battle of Gettysburg, which we are studying today, took place at this time. It was seen by Robert E. Lee as the battle which would define and end the war, and yet this decision of his to fight this battle in Pennsylvania at Gettysburg proved a turning point for the Civil War as a whole. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought between General Lee's 75,000 strong army and Major General Meade's 95,000 strong Union forces. 3 days of brutal carnage, and the total count of dead exceeded 48,000. However, the victory was the Union army's. This victory was, however, dearly won, and from this point onwards, the Union side began to win. And though it took 2 more years for the war to end and for the United States of America to be reborn as one nation once again, this was the point at which things changed for the Union forces, and the point at which hope once again re-emerged for the Union and for the northern states. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is immortalized in American history as one of those crucial speeches which tell us about the making of the American nation. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address begins not as the point at which the references to slavery begin and end, but begins as a takeoff from the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. It consists of just 10 sentences, 270 words approximately, depending on where we place hyphens, word breaks, etc. It took him about 2 minutes to deliver. And in it he said, and I quote, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here," unquote. But ironically, Gettysburg today is not remembered for the horrific slaughter that took place there. Instead, Gettysburg today is remembered for Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, for the pithy, concise encapsulation of what that battle meant and what the Civil War itself meant for America. The first paragraph of the speech gives us the background to the event and to the speech itself. It answers, in effect, the questions, why have we gathered here? And what have we gathered here for? The second paragraph builds upon this beginning, and it goes on to elaborate ideas of dedication and consecration, and talks about why this consecration is necessary. It also then moves it into the future as it tells us that due to this consecration, democracy itself will continue to flourish, not just in America, but also in the world. It is particularly significant to notice that Lincoln at no point refers to either the United States or to Gettysburg, the battle, nor to the Union or the Confederacy. In fact, interestingly enough, though he was the President of the United States, though he was the Commander-in-Chief of the Union forces, he makes no distinction between the Union forces and the Confederate forces, their enemies, because he considers them part of one nation. So he does not even acknowledge the divide that exists between the southern and the northern states. He makes no partisan espousal of soldiers, nor does he speak other than obliquely of the issue of slavery and emancipation. In fact, the rights of blacks and the rights of the slaves finds no mention here. The Gettysburg Address covers a sweeping range, refusing to be tied down to narrow loyalties or to temporary alliances. For Lincoln, there is a nation, and there are its people, and these are what are significant and of historical importance. Before we conclude this module, I would like to read aloud this actual speech, which is made possible because it just takes about 2 minutes. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln's 2-minute speech might have lasted for a very brief time. As we have already noted, it lasted for just about 2 minutes. But though the speech in actual time took only 2 minutes, in terms of the time within the speech, Lincoln moves backwards in time to when the nation was first formed, which is in 1776, and he moves forward in time to the idea that the nation will be born once again in time to come. Thus, in speaking in terms of the time that the speech itself covers, he moves both into the past and then from there to the present and then into the future. Chronologically speaking, then, Lincoln moves from past to present and then invokes the future for us, his listeners, and today his readers. The first phrase of the speech with which he begins 77 years ago takes us back, to be precise, to July 4th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was first adopted by the American founding fathers. He takes us back to the point 87 years ago, because a score in English means 20 years. He takes us back to the point where 87 years ago a nation was conceived and brought forth in liberty. Abraham Lincoln is, of course, at this point also using the idea of conception and birth, literally speaking, right? That the nation which was conceived in 1776 was brought forth a few years later after the American Revolution ended and America achieved freedom. This was an independence that was based upon the idea that all men are created equal. Abraham Lincoln refers to this when he says that it is dedicated to the proposition, right? So thus, by directly quoting and invoking the moment of the Declaration of Independence, Abraham Lincoln has shifted the Gettysburg Address back in time. He refers to a point 87 years ago when the nation was brought forth. And the nation was brought forth built upon the idea that all men are created equal. The irony, of course, of this was that even as it was said that all men are created equal, and this declaration was adopted by the founding fathers of America, several of them were themselves slaveholders. Lincoln then reminds us, the readers today, as well as his audience in 1863, of the historical importance of the Declaration. He also reminds us of the relevance of that document to the Gettysburg battle as well as to the Civil War. This is made clear in the second sentence, which begins that, "Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure." So he has arrived then, his present, 1863, and he speaks of the great civil war that is then raging in America, which began in 1861 and which was to continue till 1865. And he says that what has the Civil War been based upon? It is based upon the idea that it is a test that such a nation conceived and dedicated to such an idea, the idea of the equality of all men, whether it can long endure. In the final sentences of the speech, Abraham Lincoln then moves his listeners then and his readers now into a future wherein, and I quote from the speech, "This nation under God shall have a new birth." When he says this, he indicates to us the fact that he believes whether or not the Civil War is won by the Confederates or whether by the Union forces, this Civil War will nonetheless lead to the point where the American nation will have a new birth. A new birth which might be as a nation which is dedicated to the idea that all men, black and white, are created equal, or a new birth as a nation wherein the blacks will never be equal. But nonetheless, when the Civil War finally ends, it will end at a point when America will be born again. Thus, the time frame that Lincoln proposes is one where the nation moves from its birth in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, through testing times, which is the present when the Civil War is raging, through times when its founding ideology is shaken, when it is called into question, and finally it will move to a time in the future when that founding ideology will either be reinstated and will prevail, or will be wiped out and a new ideology will replace it. It is interesting that in terms of time, Lincoln is speaking at more or less the central point of the Civil War. Speaking in 1863, when the Civil War has already been raging for 2 years, when the Confederate forces have been winning. He is speaking at the first great battlefield where the Union forces have won a significant victory, and yet the future is still uncertain. And yet, when he speaks of the fact that this nation under God shall have a new birth, he is gesturing towards the fact that whether or not it survives in its present form or in an altered form, it will still remain a nation under God. Given the fact that the address is a speech delivered at the dedication of a cemetery, it's a local event with a limited reach. Gettysburg is a tiny little town in the state of Pennsylvania, which is one of the states of the United States of America. He begins with the continent and with the nation when he says that, and I quote, "Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation." He locates Gettysburg very specifically in the United States of America, which is itself located within the American continent. By locating himself and the occasion in the larger project of nation building that the founding fathers of America began, Lincoln creates a sense of both historical continuity in terms of time, as well as an acknowledgement of the fact that the theaters, the battlefields of the American Civil War test the idea of the nation, the American nation, which is itself part of the great American continent. He then, of course, speaks of the battlefield on which they are met, and he further narrows it down when he points out that he does not speak of the battle but of the battlefield. Later on, he further narrows it down when he says that he speaks of a portion. We are met here on a portion of that field. So it's not the entire battlefield, it is not the town of Gettysburg, but merely a portion of that field. From there, he then moves on to speaking of dedicating a portion of that battlefield as, and I quote, "a final resting place for those who here gave their lives." So then we have moved from the continent to the nation, to the battlefield wherein that nation is being tested, to a portion of that battlefield which is then being dedicated as a national cemetery for the Americas. And from that portion of the battlefield which is being dedicated as a cemetery, he moves to the specific, the resting place of those who here gave their lives. By employing this tactic of first broadening it out and then narrowing down the spatial reach of his speech, Lincoln also does something else. He unites the soldiers who died on the battlefield with the founding fathers of the United States of America, bringing them together in one paragraph and giving them a common agenda, that they together are in the process of building this nation, the American nation. He also accords worth to each of those deaths, the deaths of those who died in the Battle of Gettysburg, as he points out their significance in spatial terms. Their resting places, individual graves of those soldiers who died here in this battle, they have a resonance for this nation which has been conceived and brought forth by the founding fathers of America, etc. In the second paragraph, Lincoln, after narrowing it down, once again moves outward. He talks about the significance of the battlefield, not just for the American nation, but also for the world at large. When he speaks here now, he speaks of the battle, he speaks of the battlefield. He does not speak of it in terms of the Union and the Confederate sides, but instead he speaks of the significance of the battle which was waged here for the United States of America, and therefore then consequently for the entire world. Thus, when he says that the world will not remember the speeches which are delivered here at Gettysburg today, November 1863, but they will remember the deaths of the soldiers, those soldiers who died there between July 1st and July 3rd, 1863. He amplifies the reach of the soldiers' death, that they will be remembered and reckoned as important, not because they fought and died at Gettysburg, but for what their deaths at Gettysburg achieved for America and therefore also for the world at large. Those deaths will echo through posterity, through the world. In the final sentence, he of course broadens his reach out as he claims that due to the Gettysburg battle, a democratic nation and idea will not perish from the earth. And that is a quotation from his speech once again, that it will, quote, not perish from the earth. So the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg is not local, it is not national, but instead it is global and for the entire earth. And this is what it means that America is a city upon the hill. The United States imaged itself and spoke of itself as being a city upon a hill. A city upon a hill is something which the light of which cannot be hidden. It shows the way to the world and it leads the entire earth. In addition, it is significant to note that during this brief address, Lincoln uses the word here 8 times in his speech. Every time he uses the word here, he then draws significance to where they stand. And he points out the significance of that location. Here, the Gettysburg battlefield. Here, the Gettysburg cemetery. He points out to the significance of that here in the national dream and the national project. The allusions in the Gettysburg Address are actually from just 2 sources, the Declaration of Independence and, of course, the Bible, which was supposed to be Abraham Lincoln's favorite reading matter. It was what he read all the time, what he returned to over and over again. And the Bible informs a lot of the speech patterns that Abraham Lincoln used in all the speeches that he made. When he says 77, he is referring to also the notion that the nation's life is a little more than the lifespan of an ordinary human being. If the ordinary human being lasts for 70, which is basically 70 years, the American nation has, at the point of the Gettysburg Civil War, just lasted for 77 years, 87 years. It's very young, speaking in terms of natural man's life. The Declaration is, of course, invoked by the phrase which he quotes directly from the Declaration when he says, and I quote, "All men are created equal." When he says all men are created equal, he reminds us of the principle on which the American nation is based, the principle that all men were created equal. In the America, slavery had existed, coexisted simultaneously and at the same time as the idea of liberty. It also, of course, serves to remind the listeners then and the readers today of one of the foremost reasons for the war, the fact that the war was fought for slavery. So when Abraham Lincoln refers to the fact that all men are created equal, he reminds us also the fact that though as a principle it was adopted, it was not practiced in the United States of America. 2 words which recur repeatedly in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address are the words here and we. So Gettysburg is the here that Lincoln refers to repeatedly, almost obsessively. But as interesting as the use of the word here is the use of the word we. Lincoln, when he says we, does not refer to only the Union side or to the Union soldiers. When he says we, uses it in its inclusive sense, where he uses it to indicate both the northern and the southern states, both the Union and the Confederate soldiers, both the Union and Confederate soldiers who died here at this battlefield. So Lincoln, by using we repeatedly in the speech, also then indicates the possibility and the hope that one day all these people will together once again be an us who will be united as the United States of America. Then, of course, through the speech, Lincoln uses alliteration, consonants, contrast, and double contrast, devices which further add to the effective nature of his words. So thus we have in the speech ideas which are then repeated over and over again and contrasted. He also uses double contrast. Thus he has an example over here. I will provide you with an example over here when he says, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. So there he lays the ground for the fact that the people who are gathered here on this battlefield to dedicate this national cemetery, they cannot dedicate, consecrate, hallow this ground. He contrasts it with the next sentence. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. So even as he sets up an idea, he contrasts it with the following sentence, where he then says that the dedication has already been performed by the battle which raged here, by those who lived and died here, and who then have consecrated it by their blood which was spilt over here on this battlefield. He also uses two triads in this speech. One, of course, is the one which I just quoted, which was, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The second, of course, is the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish. In the first, the repetition of we cannot, and he repeats it and he hammers it home. The futility of the attempts of the living to do or add to the work that the dead soldiers have already performed and accomplished here on this ground. The second phrase is, of course, what is most remembered from this speech today. It is immortalized as a formulation which describes a democracy, that it is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It is important to remember that this phrase, which is today used as a definition of democracy, was used by Lincoln very specifically to say that the American nation would then ensure that democracy itself would flourish and remain alive in the world. When he concludes his speech, he is referring to events in the American nation. One, that this nation, which is conceived in freedom, brought forth in liberty, shall continue. But two, also that a government which has been elected by the people has the right to determine what that nation's shape will be. And therefore then, that democracy will prevail in America.